Hi, welcome to the summer tree video of where the heart is. This is going to be our what our summer tree looks like. It's a cute little apple tree. It is going to be sewed in two different steps. Basically, we are first going to sew the individual sections of the tree trunk. So there'll be two sections. One section will kind of divide it up right there. So this will be one section, and then this will be the other section. We're going to do that on water-soluble stabilizer, and this is what you're going to need. You're going to need two different size rectangles, small rectangles for the base of the tree. This is your tree trunk. We're going to need our grass, and also a couple rectangles for our background fabric. So refer to your instructions to the correct sizes. And we are going to stitch these on a lightweight cutaway stabilizer. Now my hoop is a fairly large hoop, and my stabilizer just happens to be that it didn't quite fit in there. So what I did is I stitched a zigzag across two pieces. And sometimes you may have a piece that's too big, and so you cut some off and have some waste. So sometimes you can take those two smaller pieces and just zigzag them together to keep it nice and stable. But I have them in the hoop, and the first step we're going to do is with water-soluble thread. We are going to sew an outline for where our fabric is to be placed. Okay, so our second step, we have our fabric, our background sky fabric attached. We clip the corners and just... Okay, now we're ready for step 3, and that's going to be to sew a seam for our grass fabric. I wanted to point out to you too that this square right here, this is going to be over on the right side. So this part here is where you need to have the bulk of your fabric. So you want about a ½ inch here. And this is going to be the left side of the tree trunk base. So you'll want to have about a ½ inch of it here. You can see here I have about a ¼ inch and here and ½ inch. So I just wanted to point that out to you real quick. Another thing, I think I might need to trim a couple corners to a scant ¼ inch before I continue with the grass. So I have that all trimmed up, and then I have neutral thread in my machine, and I'm going to place my grass fabric right side down with the raw edges even. And again, we're going to watch and having about a ½ inch on the outside sections of the block. So I will do the same thing over here, and then we'll have the machine stitch seams, and then we'll go from there. So here's our seam stitch for our grass. So we're going to flip that right side up. We're going to finger press it in both sections. We have water-soluble thread in the machine, and we're going to sew tack down stitches. If you want to, with a little fabric glue to hold that down in place, you're certainly more than welcome to do that. So let me take it to the machine and stitch the tack. So here's my step 4. That was my tack down. I've already trimmed off the corners here. So we're going to trim off a ¼ inch. And then step number 5 is going to be taking the base of the tree. We're going to lay a piece here, right side down, raw edges even. And then we'll have the machine stitch the seams. So now we can flip these over. Step 6 is water-soluble thread in the needle only, and it'll sew a tack. Okay, the next step in our tree trunk base is that we're going to add the main part of the tree trunk fabric. So we'll do right side down, raw edges even, and we will sew the seam. And I'm going to make it so that the bulk of my fabric goes below here. So this is going to end up being the bottom of our tree trunk base. In other words, it's this part of the tree trunk base. So I want at least a ½ inch to be available right down there on the bottom. So neutral thread in the machine, in the needle, and I'll sew the seam. Okay, we almost have our two little sections done. We're going to take the tree trunk fabric, flip it over and finger press it, and sew the tack down stitch. Okay, we have our tree base finished for our summer tree, which is our apple tree. And refer to your instructions, and we have shown you in your instructions how to cut this. And I like to transfer that information to my blocks while they're still in the hoop. That way there is no question once I take it out of the hoop if I'm looking at it oriented the wrong way, upside down or whatever, and the information is right there where I need it. So I'm going to go ahead and take it out of the hoop now that I have transferred that information. Put the hoop aside for now. So here's our two different sections for our tree base. I have trimmed the stabilizer away right up to the basting stitch so we don't have any bulk in the seam. And I have used the measurements on your instructions to trim the fabric the correct amount. Now I want to tell you that the 1/2 inch that is going to be on the bottom and the sides, as long as it's minimum 1/2 inch, you don't have to trim it. You can if you want to, but it's not really necessary. But as long as you have 1/4 inch here and 1/4 inch seams here ready to go, then we should be all set. So I'm going to take it to the regular sewing machine. I'm going to put the right sides together. I'm going to pin it and sew a 1/4 inch seam for our tree base. Okay, I'm getting ready to sew the seam on my tree base. And I'm going to put right sides together. I'm going to pin it. I'm going to pin it by putting my first pin right in the corner of the block where those basting stitches are, and then do the same for the block or section that I'm joining it to. I'm not going to bring the pin back through. I'm just going to do just like that. I am going to do the same for this other corner. Okay, so they're both like that. And then I'm going to take yet another pin, and then I'm going to go through the seam allowance and then back into the section. And I'll take that pin out, and I can do the same thing down here. And I can take this one out, and I'm going to do the same thing in the center. I'm going to put the pin through the basting stitch, and it came back out through the basting stitch on that side. Leave that pin in there, grab another pin, now pin through the seam allowance and then back into that section. Now what I'm going to do is with neutral thread, I'm going to sew right on that basting stitch. Gives me a guide to sew on. And so let's do that. So here's our tree base sections. I've just stitched with a neutral thread right on top that stitch. And let's open it up. And there we go. So now I can press it. I would recommend pressing towards the dark side, which in I think most cases is going to wind up being the tree trunk. The other thing that you might want to notice also is, hopefully the camera can pick it up, but you can see a little bit of the basting stitch peeking through. And just so you know, we use water soluble thread. If you use that like we tell you to, that'll just go away and it won't be anything that you'll have to pick out later. So I just wanted you to be aware. That's one of the reasons we use water soluble thread. It's a question we get asked quite often as to why we use that, and that would be a good reason why. So let me go press this, and then we can start the rest of the apple tree block. Okay, this is our part 2 of our summer tree block. We have our base section already made, and we're going to be stitching the rest of the block like we normally do with Hoop Sisters, incorporating that section that we just made. So some of the things we'll need besides the section is we'll need our backing fabric, the optional wool batting if you choose to do that. This is the section of our apple tree. And then we have a couple different size of triangles. So the bigger triangles will go at the top, and the smaller triangles will end up being the corner sections of our apple tree. And then we'll add this on there. Oops, hopefully not upside down, but we'll add the tree base section on there as well. So let's get started with step number 1, which is water soluble thread in the needle and embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin. And the machine will stitch a placement stitch of the square so we know where to put our wool batting. Okay, I've used a colored thread rather than the water-soluble. You'll use a water-soluble thread when you actually do this. I just wanted you to be able to see it. Step 2 is an optional step, and that is the wool batting, additional batting in there, and that's to give your block some dimension. And that will get placed right here inside of what we just stitched. And then using water-soluble thread again, you're going to be stitching a zigzag around the perimeter. Now we have prepared the wool batting with the sides of it pressed so that they are flat, and that's so your presser foot doesn't get caught into it. You may also want to raise your presser foot height adjustment so that it is sewing in a higher position than what it normally would, and that will also be things that'll make it easier so your foot doesn't get caught in here. So let me go ahead and stitch the wool batting to our battleizer. So here's our step 2 completed, and again, if you choose not to use the wool batting, you'll skip to the next step. Step 3, we will just be stitching more placement stitches on top of the wool, or the battleizer if you choose not to use it. If you're using the wool, again, make sure your presser foot height is in a higher position, and as the machine is sewing, just kind of keep your finger ahead of the presser foot to help push that wool down, and you won't have any problems whatsoever. Okay, so you can see the outline of where some of our fabric pieces are going to go. And in step 4, which is this step, we're going to place our tree fabric right over the top of this. We would like it to be even on the sides, so about a 1/2 inch on both sides. Leave about a 1/4 inch right there where that line is, and you should end up with about a 1/2 inch at the top. So now we're going to take it to the machine, and with water-soluble thread we're going to sew a tack down stitch. Okay, with our step 4 complete, we now are going to trim these to a scant 1/4 inch. Kind of a tough angle, but I want you to be able to see it. So for step 5, we are going to place the larger triangles right side down, raw edges even, over this section, and then it'll sew a seam. So for step 6, it's going to sew a seam in this section, so we're going to put our sky/background fabric in that corner and sew a seam with neutral thread. For step 7, we're going to sew a seam in this corner. Before we do that, we're going to want to flip the fabric, these corners, and we're going to want to finger press it to get it up out of the way. And then our seam will sew right up to that. So place your smaller triangle right side down with your raw edges even, and still with neutral thread, we're going to sew another seam. Step 8 will be another seam using neutral thread, and we will place this one right here in this corner. We can finger press this also. Okay, so here's our step 8, our seam. We can flip it and finger press it. We're going to want to make sure all of our different sections are finger pressed and flipped over nicely. We're going to start in this corner for step 9, and it's going to sew a tack down stitch. We're going to use water soluble thread for the next few steps. Step number 9 is a tack down in this corner, and then it does a tack down in this corner, and then this corner, and then this corner, all using water soluble thread, and that's step 9, 10, 11, and 12. Here is the block with our completed tack downs in all 4 corners. The next step, which is going to be starting at step 13, is going to be with our tree trunk section. We're going to put it right sides together. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to, with the machine, with the hand wheel, manually turn it so that the needle goes down and line this up so that the needle lands right in the corner where the basting stitch is. Once it's placed in the correct spot, then you can go ahead and sew the first tack down stitch. And it's just going to do a little back and forth stitch, and we're going to use water soluble thread so that it holds it in place. What key markers that you can also look at is this stitch, or yeah, this stitch right here should line right up with that, and the same over here. One of the things that you probably should be aware of too is if you haven't used darker thread on the seam, I hope you can see this, but I'm placing a pin right here, and that's to help show me where the needle needs to go down. I'm going to mark it then with a ink pen, just put a little dot there because I did not use a darker thread. So you could do either one, you could do both, but this would be for the second and third tack down for our tree trunk, which would be step 13, so step 14 and step 15 is where you want that to go, the needle to go right down right where that pin is. So I'm going to take the pin out, just did a little ink mark there in the corner, and here I just know that it's where this seam line here, this is your actual seam line, meets the basting stitch. So that's just to help verify where the pin should be going. So there's where the needle should go down there and there for step 14 and 15. So again, just for a quick review, we're adding our tree trunk section. Before we sew the seam, it's going to do some matching tack down. So we're going to right sides together, do a needle down in our first position for step 13. When the needle is perfectly placed in that corner, then we'll go ahead and hit the start button. It'll sew a tack. Then it'll move to this section, and the needle will go down right where that little ink dot is. And once it goes down and it's positioned exactly in the right place to match it, then we can go ahead and sew that tack down. We will do the same thing here and the same thing here also in this corner. We're going to be using water soluble thread for these steps, so and I'll hopefully can get a good camera angle for you. So hang on, here we go. Okay, I have my water soluble thread in the needle. I have my section placed where I think it's going to go. I'm going to look at these lines just for kind of a general idea, and then I'm going to place my needle, turning my hand wheel down so the needle lands perfectly in that corner. And I'll also take a look at my lines over here, make sure that they are looking good, and they are. So I will bring my needle back up and hit the start button. It sews the tack down stitch and moves on to the next section where we will do the same thing, where that seam line meets the base of the stitch, and I put a little ink mark there. I'm going to get my needle perfectly placed where it needs to be. Okay, that looks good. And then I'm going to hit the start button, and we will sew another tack down, and that is step 14. Step 15, it will do the same thing, only one spot over, and this is to get our match points perfectly. This is why we're doing this. So there's my needle down in a perfect position. I'll bring it back up and hit the start button once again. Sew another match point or tack down, and move on to the corner. And in this corner, I'm going to have the needle go down perfectly in that corner. And that looks pretty doggone good. I'll hit the start button, watch your fingers. It sews another little tack down. And again, this is going to be stitched over with the seam. But since we really can't pin it when it's in the embroidery machine, we do the next best thing. We're going to do little tack down match point stitches with water soluble thread, and then go back over and sew the seam. Then it will be sewn perfectly where it needs to be. So I hope that's... Okay, so I have my neutral thread in the needle only. I still have embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin. I've slowed the machine down I'm going to watch just to make sure that it is stitching right on that basting stitch from our section piece. It's got a little piece of thread there that's kind of getting in my way. Get that out of there. And it looks like it's landing right on there thanks to doing our little tack down stitches ahead of time. Alright, we are all set for step 18. And for step 18 we are going to be flipping and finger pressing and pulling this down, and again doing another tack down so it lands right in the corner. When you get it in the right place, go ahead and hit the start button. And then it moves on to step 19, which is where the green and the brown fabric meet. You're going to want that needle to go down right in the perfect spot. And we will stitch a tack down. We're using water-soluble thread for these steps. And we repeat the process on the opposite side. And then for the final corner, do a little tack down. So the final tack down is step 21. And then after that it does the main tack down around that entire section that we just sewed on there. Okay, we are almost finished with our tree. I wanted to have you take notice, and hopefully you can see it in the camera. If not, you'll see it probably on your own blocks. And that is our final basting stitch that tacked down this section at the bottom. Went a little bit below the basting stitch that's stitched when you did the sections on the stabilizer, and that's going to be just absolutely fine. It doesn't matter if it goes a little bit lower because we're not matching this block to any other block, so it's going to be fine. Don't fret about that. It's just the way it's supposed to be and the way it is. So now step 23, we're going to put some red thread in the machine, and we're going to sew some apples. We'd rather have green apples than go for green, but we're going to sew some red on here, so we'll be back to show. Okay, we've stitched our apples on this block. You're going to have some jump threads to cut. And then for step 24, we're going to flip it over, and we're going to, you may need to clean up the back a little bit too. And then we're going to center our backing fabric. And with water-soluble thread, we're going to sew a basting stitch to attach this to the back of the block. Okay, we're ready for step 25, and that is going to be some stitching, some bark embroidery stitching that's going to be on the tree and the tree. Here's our completed step 25, which is the stitching on the trunk of the tree. And since this was done with the backing fabric on it, we matched our needle thread and we brought our bobbin thread to the top, and that makes for a nice cleaner looking back. The next step is the final step, and it's our quilting of the swirls of wind. So I have matched my background / sky fabric, my thread to that fabric, and so we will go ahead and we will do the final step. Okay, I have my summer tree block finished, and before you take it out of the hoop you need to do what I did, and that is refer to the instructions on how to trim them. The sides, since there'll be a block on both sides of our summer apple tree, will be joined with another block. So in that case, when that happens, you're going to use the trimmer 2.0, and you're going to cut everything away right up to the basting stitch and cut the fabric on the front 1/4 inch seam. And then on the since this is the summer row and it's sandwiched in between 2 other rows with one on top and one on the bottom, you're going to trim it 1.5 inches through all the layers, 1.5 inches from the basting stitch, and same here on the bottom. So now that I have it marked, I feel confident that I won't mess it up, and I will take it out of the hoop. And I think the first thing I'll do is I'll start with my sides. I'll trim those first, the ones that are going to be trimmed through all layers. So 1.5 inches, the ruler side of the trimmer by George is marked. It says sashing. It's not really for the purpose that we're doing it, but it just happens to be 1.5 inches. So we will go ahead and place that on the basting stitch, the 1.5 inch mark. And then go ahead and cut that away. Don't worry that you don't have fabric covering this. We do need to have this because it's going to be the batting that will be underneath the sashing that will be on the front and the back. So we do need to have that. That's why we cut it 1.5 inches through all the layers. And we'll do the same on this bottom. If you see multiple basting lines, just choose the one that's at the bottom, which was the final one. And then we're down to the 2 sides that get trimmed by the trimmer by George. The trimmer by George, if you haven't seen it already, it has a metal edge, a thin metal edge glued to the end of the ruler. And that's so that you can snug right up to the basting stitch. So you just slide that underneath the fabric and then lay it down. You'll need a 60mm rotary cutter. And then you can cut away the battleizer and also the backing fabric. So it's right up to the basting stitch. Then the only thing that's left is the fabric on the front. And since we'll have another block sewn to this, this will be our seam allowance. So we're now going to clean it up and trim it to 1/4 inch. And we'll do the same for this side. So again, we just snug this right up underneath the fabric. Just check, double check, make sure there's no fabric showing. And cut it with the 60mm rotary cutter, and then flip the trimmer by George 2.0 ruler side up and lay the 1/4 inch line on the basting stitch, and then we're going to trim this. So here is our completed block. It's looking pretty good. And this is what the back looks like, where we still have 1.5 inches on the top and bottom, but the sides, everything's been trimmed right up to the base, right up to that basting stitch, with the 1/4 inch of the fabric on the front still there to be able to sew the seam. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoy stitching out your summer tree, and we will see you next time. Thanks for watching.